it was first released as a mystery knit-along, or how I called it, Mystery Yokalong. You can maybe see this little braid-like feature that is a derivative of Latvian braids. There are a lot of options for modifying this and making it your own. Hello, my name is Jeanette. I am the designer behind Jeanette Knits, and in this video I'll tell you all about the sweater that I'm wearing and how you could possibly make one yourself. I'll talk about where it came from, the yarn, the gauge and needles, all the techniques used, as well as the construction. I'll also show you some work in progress photos for inspiration of color combinations, and I'll finish this video with close-up demos of all the techniques and tips and tricks to make a success. If this is your first colorwork sweater, or even if it's not, you might pick up some useful insights throughout this project. So this is a top-down round yoke colorwork sweater with deep running colorwork, and that means past the sleeve separation, and it was first released as a mystery knit-along, or how I called it, Mystery Yokalong. This is actually the second year we've teamed up with a knitting shop in New Jersey called Do Ewe Knit. That is U spelled as E-W-E. And they carry amazing yarns, including some of my favorites. That is Spincycle, which is this color changing contrast color that I've used here called Dyed in the Wool. And I am using here the Do Ewe Knit shop's exclusive colorways, namely Across the Universe and Unicorn. And the other partner in this knit along is Moondrake, as she is the person behind the main color yarn. It's called Ultraviolet Stardust, and I've used a colorway called a Lemon. I am very surprised by my color choices. Normally I wouldn't use yellow much at all, but in this case that was the color that really made this Across the Universe and Unicorn pop. And it was very important to have a high contrast between the main color and the contrast color to really show the intricate details. But now more about the Mystery Yokalong. No one knew what the final look of the sweater would be, so when people started the Yokalong, all they had was just this first part here, the start of the yoke, and a little bit of this, there's a bit of Garter Mosaic section. And as well, you can maybe see this little braid-like feature that is a derivative of Latvian braids, but not quite. And it was a cause for a lot of emotions because it's a little fiddly to work. But in the end, I thought it was worth it, so I included it in the pattern. There is also an alternative if you don't want to fiddle or you don't feel like it's worth your time. There's an alternative option for a much simpler, but still a really cool look. And the second clue was from about here to where these bigger chunky shapes start. So that was released a week later, and everybody was working stranded color work in the round. And then in clue 3, we saw these bigger shapes, and we also separated the sleeves and the body. And we started continued working the body until about here. There is a waist shaping option, so for those who wanted a more narrower waist, they could do the decreases there as well, or just keep it straight. And in week 3, we went to clue 4, which was a little bit more of those braids, as well as another Garter Mosaic section here. And in clue 5, we saw these longer floats in stranded color work and introduced the Ladderback Jacquard method, optional as well, for catching those long floats. And then in clue 6, we finally added the neckband and finished the body of the sweater. And clue 7 was the final clue where we added the last missing piece, and that was the sleeve. So there's a little bit of stranded color work from the clue 3 type, and then the rest is just a stockinette with the twisted 2x2 rib finish. As we released the last glue last week, I thought it was time to put it all together, and now the pattern is available as a complete pattern in 6 different languages. That is English, Danish, Dutch, German, French, and Spanish. And you can get it on Ravelry or our website. And you do need the pattern to follow the tutorials later anyway, as all the stitch counts are and the actual charts are there. A little bit more about the gauge and needles. This is sport and fingering weight yarns. So the contrast color is sport weight officially, and the main color is fingering weight. But I think you can mix and match how you feel as long as you get the gauge, which is 28 stitches times 34 rows in a 10 by 10 or a centimeter or 4 by 4 inch. The stitch gauge is much more important than the row gauge because there is an option to adjust the yoke length, and because it's knit top down, you can pretty much adjust any length, the body, the sleeves, as well as because we're adding the neckband later on, you can decide how high you want it to go. Make a turtleneck, I think there was an option like that, or you want to make short sleeves, there's plenty of those as well. So row gauge is not so important, the stitch gauge is the one that's important. And as long as you get that gauge, and then you can work with sport weight or fingering weight, whichever gives you a fabric that you feel is more to your liking. So sport weight might be a little bit denser, and fingering weight will be more drapier at this gauge, so go by what you feel is right for you. We do have to use 2 needle sizes for this project. For the main fabric, that is the color work here and the stockinette in the main color sections, to get the 28 stitches, I had to use 2.75 millimeters. That is a US size 2. But for some of these sections here, and for the neckband, because we want it to be more sturdy and support the stretch, and because Garter has a tendency to expand widthwise, we go down a needle size. So in fact, the whole of Clue 1 was done on a smaller than gauge needle, and for me that was 2.25 millimeter or US size 1. If you're a tight knitter, it's very likely that you'd have to go up a needle size. That is not uncommon for my patterns, as I'm on the looser side. The pattern comes in 9 sizes, and it is designed to be worn with about 10 to 15 centimeter, that is 4 to 6 inch positive ease around the chest area. If, however, you are a little bustier, so your bust is a larger than C cup, I would advise to go by your upper bust measurement and allow a little less ease around the full bust, but that will ensure that your sweater fits around the shoulders better, and you don't have a lot of bulging, oversized yoke going on. And the finished chest measurements are 91.5 centimeters for the smallest size, that is 36.5 inches, and 170 centimeters for the largest size, that is 68 inches around the chest. As I talk through the clues, I already indicated a little bit of the construction and what techniques are used. There were quite a few new techniques to many participants, including my favorite increase techniques that I like to use. That is a twisted, lifted increases. These float braids that are derived from Latvian braids, but not quite. There was Garter Mosaic. There was just stranded color work with fairly short floats, and stranded color work with long floats that required Ladderback Jacquard technique to catch them. There are also some short rows here to raise the back. I used the Japanese short rows, and those are also demoed and described in the pattern, but it can be substituted with any short row method. And the short rows are scattered, not worked in one block, because we start with the contrast color, and in my case, and in a lot of people's cases, it was a color changing, so we didn't want a sharp change between where we start the sweater and stop the short rows. So the short rows are sort of scattered throughout the top part of the yoke. Mind you that the larger the size, the more rounds you will work, before you start the color work charts. So the section for your size might be bigger. I'm wearing size 2, so the larger the size, the more rounds we had to do to get from the neck circumference to the number of stitches we need to start the chart. And to get that even and smooth increases, we do need more rounds. Now, possible modifications. There are a lot of options for modifying this and making it your own. Not to mention, you could skip some of these completely. There were some people who didn't do clue 4 at all and jumped straight to the clue 5 because they might have had a shorter torso and they didn't want a long sweater like that, so they wanted to finish earlier, or they weren't a fan of the braids or the mosaic knitting. The same was with the sleeves. As per pattern, you finish clue 3, but some people decided that they might like better the look of the last clue here, and instead of doing this patterning here between the chevrons, or what are they, between the V's, they inserted this little leg here, and that looked great. Some people continued clue 4 and clue 5 charts on the sleeves as well. Some people had short sleeves. There are already baked in options for a straight fit as well as waist shaping. And the most amazing variety that we saw was on the neckbands. As per pattern, you have a 2x2 twisted rib here, worked to this height that I like. That's my personal preference. But there were people who didn't do the neckband at all, and they left a wider neckline. There was a turtleneck option. There were all kinds of corrugated ribbing variations as well, because people were afraid they will be running out of the contrast color yarn and not have enough for sleeves, so they tried to incorporate some of the main color there as well. And I seriously can't list all the possible modifications, but yes, the neckband was the one that was the most varied. There were also people who included some of the color work here just before the cuff and made the cuff different to match the neckband, etc. Sky is the limit. And another thing that makes this sweater unique is if you choose the color changing yarn, there is so much color work that it's not just in the yoke, it's also in the body and the sleeves, that even if you've picked the same colorways, which happened in the mystery, you still get a totally different sweater out at the end. And I would love to show you some of those. So here is a gallery of some of the works in progress that we saw after clue 5 came out. If you want to see the finished sweaters, I suggest you join our school community and check out the feed, especially the thread that's called the Mystery Yokalong Finished Objects. Or you could also check the Ravelry projects page for this pattern. I believe that most people have now uploaded their most recent photos of their progress or their finished sweaters there as well. And right after the gallery, I'll jump straight into showing you how we cast on and move through all the techniques across all the clues. And I hope you enjoy following along. And I'll see you in the next one. When you're ready to start to cast on the Mystery Yokalong, we'll be beginning with the contrast color. And we'll cast on at the base of the neck, and we'll add the neckband later. The reason being that if there's for any reason any trouble with how the yoke fits, or how it's or it sits differently on your shoulders because everybody's body is different, you have the chance to fix that or make adjustments when you're doing the neckband. So that's why I always like to add the neckband at the very end. And For that reason, we need to pick a cast on that allows us to pick up stitches easily and knit in the other direction when we're ready to add the neckband. My choice is the long tail cast on because I find it that for me it's quite easy to pick up stitches along that, but you could go with a provisional cast on or whatever other cast on you like. And if you already know that you are unlikely to want to add a neckband because you love wide necks, then you have the chance to go for a decorative cast on as well. This pattern is graded so that no size has a huge gaping neckline, and without a neckband it would work well if you prefer the wider ones. So I will leave a tail enough for my stitch count and simply use the long tail cast on. And I've also suggest to use the smaller needles for this portion. It will create a tighter gauge and it will prevent the neck from stretching out as you wear the sweater. But also the first few rows of the colorwork chart will be in a pattern that stretches the fabric widthwise. So it will be, it's basically garter stitch, as you can see. So we want to counteract that by using slightly smaller needles. We need to cast on the required number of stitches that is specified for your size in the pattern, and once we've done that, we'll be joining in the round. I've cast on the full count of my neckline stitches, and I'm ready to join in the round. In case you do not use 2 needles to cast on, then you don't need to do this step, but I like how much easier it is to work the first round and how much easier it is to pick up stitches if I've used 2 needles to cast on my stitches. So, and I will need to pull out one of them. This is always a bit tricky. I'm not quite sure which cable to pull on, but eventually it all happens. So then I like to fold it in half and make a loop right there in the middle. Well, approximately middle. I'm not going to count stitches to be precisely in the middle, and it doesn't also doesn't matter. So then I can align the needles next to each other, and before I begin working, I have to make sure that I am seeing the nice, neat right side of the cast on all the way around, and that they're not twisted anywhere. And it's very easy to do when you've got them aligned like this. So on that one I'm seeing purl bumps, so that's all good because the wrong side is inside the circle. And I will place the beginning of round marker on that needle that I will work with. So that's this right hand needle. While still holding it all together so it doesn't change orientation, because it's very, very easy for things to get twisted here. So I have to hold with all my might that nothing changes, and make sure I pick up the strand that's attached to the ball, otherwise I'll run out of yarn in no time, and knit a few stitches, pulling quite tight there because I don't want there to be too much slack, and because I don't want this marker to be dangling here, I'll pull the needle out again so that the marker is positioned between stitches on the cable and not on the loop, and continue working in the round all the way to the beginning of round marker, as the pattern says to knit 1 round. And then we'll begin something called short rows. Here I am at the end of round 1, knitting 1 round right after cast on, and we are starting short rows. We want to do short rows to raise the back neck, to make the back higher and the front to sit lower, to have a deeper neck at the front. And typically you can add short rows in one block, so we would work to an incomplete row in both directions, back and forth, and moving a little bit further away with every row. So you add like a half moon shape that is the highest here at the center of back where our beginning of round is. And after completing the short rows, we just return to work back in the round, and the front is shorter as a result. But because we're using color changing yarn, I am afraid of having a sudden color change at the front where the short rows finish, because we'll be using a lot of that yarn here at the back for the short rows, and then when we return back in the round, the border between the colors would be noticeable. So what we'll do instead is we'll scatter the short rows in between a lot of full rounds. So we'll do a short row here and there between the increase rounds, and the first short row is just 20 stitches away from the beginning of round, and you can use whatever short row method you like. I love the look of Japanese short rows, so I will be demoing that short row method here. Right, so 1 time, 2 times 3, 5 more stitches for me. Each size has their own number specified in the pattern, so you check there what you need to do. And for Japanese short row, we need to trap that yarn with either a locking stitch marker, or I love using bobby pins here, very easy to get on, and let it dangle there. Slip the first stitch, and we'll work the exact distance away. Oh, this cable's making noise. The same distance away from the beginning of round, but in the opposite direction. So obviously here I need to purl to have that stockinette look on the right side. Slip the marker, and we work again 20 stitches for my size in the other direction. I am here exactly 20 stitches away from the beginning of round, and I trap the yarn once again before turning and working backwards. So you can see those bobby pins or locking stitch markers are dangling on the wrong side. And now I'm ready to knit to beginning of round. I should slip the first stitch, yes. And then we'll knit 1 round in which we will conceal these turns. Right, so I'm beginning that round in which we will conceal the turns, and I do that by working to the turning point all the way to where I turned, and I use that bobby pin. I'll just place the yarn in front for now. Use the bobby pin or locking stitch marker to pull until a loop forms, and I can place that as a new stitch here on the left hand needle. I'll bring the yarn to back, and I will knit these two together, and that way you cannot see the turn at all. You can see that this side of the turn is longer, this is shorter, but there's no holes or anything like that. So I will knit all the way to 1 stitch before the other turn, and we'll look at how to conceal the turn when you're approaching from the shorter direction. Here I am 1 stitch before the turn on this other side. The reason why I had to stop 1 stitch before the turn is because to conceal the gap on this side, we used a stitch that is the first stitch on the shorter side. So the first stitch on the shorter side will be, when approaching from this direction, will be just 1 stitch before the turn. And we used a method, a decrease method that leans to the right. So from shorter side to the longer side, that means on this side we need to use a decrease method that leans to the left. So in our case it would be an SSK, and SSK is slip knitwise and knit through the back loop. So I just slipped this first stitch knitwise, and it's kind of very hard to place this loop here on the needle. It's very tight, so we're not even going to do that. Instead of doing the classical SSK, we'll do an alternative where we slip that first knitwise and then knit through this loop, imagining that it's on some needle. And I'm stretching it out with the help of the bobby pins so I could pull the strand of yarn through it, and I get that new stitch already on my right hand needle. And what I need to do is pass that first slip stitch over, and we get a decrease that's leaning towards the taller side, and we can remove the bobby pin because we won't no longer need it. And voila, the gap is closed. I suggest that here you kind of have to tug on the yarn right after working that decrease, otherwise any slack will stretch the stitch out and will make it appear like a disturbance in the fabric. So a little tug is necessary here, and again we get a very seamless transition to the longer side. And yeah, whenever you see a short row, these will be the steps that you need to take. And next we'll be attacking increases. I'm about to begin the first increase round, in which we will increase one stitch before every 4 stitches. And the increase method that I suggest is the most invisible, using a stitch from a row below. We can either place it on, pick up from back to front and place it on the left hand needle and knit through the back loop like so, and then knit 4 stitches, or pick it up. Don't even remove the right hand needle. Make sure that the tip of the right hand needle is behind the left hand needle, or if you're left handed and you knit in the other direction, then the tip of the active needle should be behind the tip of the passive needle, and then you can use the passive needle to stretch the stitch a little bit, the front leg of it, while you knit through the back loop. Again, 4 stitches. If I was an English style knitter, I would do it this way. And I'm much quicker continental, so I'm knitting the 4 stitches. But once again, I make sure that this tip is just behind, and I can stretch out the stitch, the front leg of it, to knit through the back loop. And we do this all the way around. That will be our first increase done. And then we've got a few plain rounds to do before we hit the short rows again. After finishing all the short rows and increases, depending on your size, it should look something like this, the back being higher than the front. If your size has more increase rounds needed, then the whole thing will probably be wider. But once you've finished that section, you're ready to start following the chart. And the first technique in the chart requires us to join the main color. We will not be working with it, we'll just be creating floats. And the first that are only visible on the front. And it will create a little braid. And it's very important to remember that both of these rows that create the braid, the direction in which we to swap the yarns is very important. So the first one, we will be swapping them by pulling from under. What that means is we join the main color so that the tail is at the back, and at the front we have the rest of the yarn, and then we knit one with the contrast color still. We bring the contrast color to the front and we pick up the main color from under, and then we pick up the contrast color again from under the main color and knit the next stitch. Again, yarn to front, picking up main from under, and then picking back up the contrast color from under. You should see little braid legs forming here, and they should all be lying slanted in that direction. We cannot change the direction in which we pick up the yarn, because that will change the slanting direction and it won't look like a nice and neat braid once we're done with it. If you are an English knitter, then you are probably holding the yarns on this side, and it's a little trickier to do this, but is doable. So we've come to where we need to swap the yarns. So again, you need to pick up the main color from under, then again the contrast color from under, and bring it to the back of work, knit the stitch and return it back to front of work. Pick up the main color from under, pick up the contrast color from under, bring it to the back of work and knit the stitch. For some reason, I feel it's a little quicker if you're a continental knitter and you're holding the yarns on the left, but it's doable. You can also experiment if you're a seasoned fair isle knitter. You could also experiment turning the work around and working it from the wrong side, and that way the floats will be at the back of work that you're probably more used to, but you have to make sure that you also keep the swapping direction all the same. And you'll probably notice that, and obviously when you get around, you'll have to, after you finish the braid, you'll have to return back to working from the right side, but hopefully that's self-explanatory. You'll notice that after a little while, the threads will get really tangled, and a quick, because we're always twisting in the same direction, and a quick way to untangle them is to hold the two strands up like that, forming a little spiral, and then just pulling it, and it should untwist your work and remove the tangledness in the yarn. And once we've done the floating, picking up from under until the beginning of round, we'll knit another round in the same style, except this time we'll be picking up the float from over, so that it creates these little floats here slanted in the opposite direction and creating a little braid. I'll show you how to do that when I get to the end of this round. And once you complete the first round of the floaties, the colorful floaties, it looks something like this. But as soon as you start the second round, you can see a nice braid forming. And that's because we're now slanting the floats in the other direction. After you worked a stitch in the contrast color, you bring both to the front, and this time you pick up the main color over the top. So main color over, and then again contrast color over this way, and work it. So you always pick it up to be over, another twist, and the stitch is always worked using this darker contrast color that we began with. And again, so if you are an English style knitter, your yarns would be on this side, and you would regardless put it over the working yarn once more, bring it to the back of work, knit the stitch, bring it back to the front, put the main color over, then the contrast color over again, to the back of work, and knit the stitch. And that's what makes this little tiny braid. It does take a long time to do it, but I hope you can see that it's worth the effort. After the braid, we've got a couple or a few rounds in just the contrast color, and it's a great opportunity to use that one round to add little stitch markers after every 22 stitches to mark where a chart pattern repeat will start and end. As the round after that, we've got a couple of increases not far from these beginning and end markers of the repeat, so it'll be much easier to do the increases if you've got these markers in place, and of course to follow the chart from then on. These markers are not mentioned in the pattern, so if in the pattern later you see a knit to marker, these ones need to be ignored because they're just there to help separate the pattern repeats. So it would be a good idea to make them slightly different than the markers that are mentioned in the pattern. In this case, to this point, the only marker that's mentioned is the beginning of round marker, and I've made that one stand out. In the chart there are some purl stitches. This is because the next section is mosaic knitting in garter stitch, and to get the garter stitch we will need to purl every second row. Some of the stitches in the chart there will be letter S, and that means that we need to just simply slip the stitch without working it, and every 2 rounds we'll change the color. So wherever you see the slipped stitches, we'll be working with the other color that isn't, and the slipped stitches should appear in that color because it's the color from the row below. So in this case I need to work with the main color first by knitting a couple of stitches, and then I am encountering the slip stitch, which I slip with the yarn at the back because I don't want there to be a float over this one here at the front. And then again I will knit 3 stitches in the main color and slip, knit 3 and slip all the way to beginning of round. So it appears as if we're working with 2 colors because we've got 2 colored stitches here on the needle, but actually we're simply slipping. And then on the second round we'll work the same stitches that we worked in the previous round, and again we'll be working with the color that doesn't have the slip stitches in the chart, but this time we'll be purling them to get that garter look. So whatever we work now, we have to read the chart, but when we work the second round in the same color, we can just look at our needle. So if we see a stitch in the main color, then we have to purl it. If we see a stitch in the contrast color, then we slip it. And of course, when we get to the next 2 rounds, we'll be again working with the contrast color, and the same will apply will only work the stitches that do not have the S on them in the chart. After clue 1, this is what our sweater should look like. And it's also the time when we need to change to a larger needle size, because we've stopped working on garter stitch and techniques that stretch the fabric width-wise. So we can go to the needle size that we got the gauge with and begin stranded color work. Now this chart will predominantly have short sections in one color. That means short floats at the back. However, the first row happens to be an exception, where per repeat we have just one stitch in the contrast color and the rest are in main color. So for me to get to where the contrast color stitch is, I will need to trap this floating yarn to avoid the long float. And the easiest method to do that is to, after every 5 or more frequent if you like stitches, just twist the yarns behind work like so. And one thing to note is that before we do that, we should stretch out the stitches that we have just worked. So let me do 5 more. After I do the required number of stitches where I want to catch the float, I want to stretch out the stitches on this needle that I just worked, and that will make sure that the float we leave has enough length to provide some the give needed for the fabric to lay flat and stretch and not pucker. And then I've got to do 4 more stitches, and we also do that stretching of these stitches every time we want to change color. So now I'm working 1 stitch in contrast color before returning to the main color again, and every time I change color I want to stretch those stitches out before trapping a float to make sure there's enough space for them. Don't bunch them up, because that will create a short tiny float and it will make the fabric bubbly and puckery like that. So that's the key. And second bit of information that would be useful to know is making sure that each strand has its own path that it's traveling. And what I mean by that is that whenever I pick up to work with the main color, I pick it over the top, and whenever I pick up to work with the contrast color, I need to make sure that I pick it up from under the main color. And that'll do 2 things. It'll keep the yarns nice and untangled, that there will not be any twisties like we had when we were working the braid, but it also will ensure that the contrast color, which in my case is this pink one, always travels across the bottom and the main across the top, and that means the contrast color will be closer to where the knit stitch begins, and that main color will, running across the top, will be pushing it out a little bit, and it will make the pop, and that's called color dominance. So for us, we want the contrast color to be dominant and to pop on the background of the main color, especially when there's just 1 stitch to work every once in a while, like in the first row. But yes, so I suggest you pick that the main color is always running across the top, the contrast color always at the bottom, and you stick with that, because if you change them all of a sudden, then it might appear that you're working even on a different pattern. It will affect your final look. And if you're someone who works with 2 yarns in each hand, then make sure that your contrast color is on the left and your main is on the right, and that way by default you'll have it always being over this contrast color. Whatever I just said does not apply to when you're trapping yarns. Oops, I lost a stitch. So when you're trapping yarn, you can twist them in whichever direction you need. I would suggest that you pick a direction that will untangle your yarns, because you're not actually working a stitch with the other color then, and then there's no effect on dominance. Again, I'm trapping the yarn. Trapping it once more. I should be 14 stitches away. Yes, and now it's my time to work with the contrast color. However you hold your yarns, it doesn't matter. If you are already holding the main color in your right hand and the contrast color, see, it's coming from under the main color, and I can work my stitch. And as soon as it's time to work with the main color, we want it to be over the contrast color, like so. Well, I drop my yarns and only use the one that I work with to manage tension better, and that's just personal, and I always have to make sure that I pick it from the right spot. Yes, so that's pretty much it. I have now worked as many rows as the pattern says that I should be splitting for sleeves, and because every one of us is different, maybe the pattern instructions don't fit your body as well, so it's very recommended that you check how this sits on you before you separate for sleeves. Mind you that the neckband will be added in a later glue, and there will be more length to the yoke before, but you should see that it should sit quite far off the neck on your shoulders, and take that into account. But if you do need to add more rows for a deeper yoke than what is stated in the pattern, feel free to continue following the same chart for as many rows as you need to, because now all increases are completed, so there shouldn't be any more stitches added, just the length. But when you're ready, all of us will do the same steps. And it's helpful to find a few locking stitch markers. Where have I got one? Like this one. And place them in 4 spots around the yoke where you will be doing the sleeve split. So after the first one, we'll be putting another one later on. These will be for the sleeve stitches. Then the next section will make the front of the sweater, and then another sleeve, and finally from here to the beginning of round we'll make the rest of the back of the sweater. And I don't know how you count, but I count in 5, so if it says 48 stitches, I know that 5 times 8 is 40, and then I need to do another 8 stitches, or 9 times 5 is 45, etc. Whatever's easier. So I count in 5s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. all the way to 8. Now I'll get my 40 stitches and I count the individual 8 stitches. That's where I will place my marker. And it makes it a little bit faster to count, but it's a bit more error prone because you also have to do some arithmetic in your head to make sure you don't count too many multiples of 5s or too little. So if you read the next instruction in the pattern, that is the next round, after each section it does tell you which chart repeat stitch, and that's one of these 36 stitches, that section should be ending with. So if yours says ending with stitch number 18, like it did for me, where did it go here? My first, I'm working on size 2, and it says that the first section is the half of the back here, should end with stitch number 18 of the chart repeat. And I can easily count from my little pattern repeat or chart repeat markers here to where I place the locking marker, whether I have 18 stitches, to verify that I've counted that right. And you have one in that instruction for after every section for verification purposes. And once you've placed them, then you just get to work in this established pattern to the first locking marker. Please ignore these little pattern chart repeat markers again. They do not matter here. We are working to the first locking marker, and that's when I'll show you how we can put these sleeve stitches on hold and how we cast on the required underarm stitches. And you'll repeat then that twice for both sides of the sweater, and then join back in the round and continue body in the round. Now that I've worked to my first locking stitch marker, I can remove it, as the where you are placing the stitch markers is that you're to remove them in the next round, because they have now served their purpose. They stopped us in our tracks so we don't knit too far. And the next step is to place the sleeve stitches from this place to the next locking stitch marker on hold. You can use stitch holders. I typically just use some yarn, leftover yarn, and using a tapestry needle transfer the stitches from the knitting needle onto that waste yarn, because it never gets in the way of me working. It's very noticeable that it's there. I'm also transferring my chart repeat markers along with the stitches here, because the sleeve might or might not continue the chart as well. So it'll be useful to know that a new pattern repeat is beginning there, in case the sleeve does have the patterning, but we'll know that in a later glue. I had transferred the yoke stitches onto 2 sets of needles so that I could try the yoke on before separating. My cable of the needle that what I was using was too short to fit over my body. I was restricted to the cables that I had at home with these wooden needles because I was traveling, and I couldn't take my metallic ones with me to risk being taken away at the airport. But I love these little wooden needles too. It's just that the cable was too short to try, but that's okay. We had another set of needles that I could use. And here I've come to the other side, to the other locking stitch marker, which I can now remove. I will also no longer need the tapestry needle. I'll make a quick knot here just to secure these stitches, these sleeve stitches. And next step, I will need to place a marker here. Again, a different one from all the other markers. It's not the beginning of round, it's not my pattern repeat starting markers. And I need to cast on some number of stitches that are indicated in the pattern. And because we have 2 strands of yarn available for us as we're working color work, we can use the long tail cast on, when we're holding the main color over our index finger and the contrast color on our thumb. So I'll just twist them here so I don't get a hole. and work the long tail method this way, so we get the main color. The stitches are in the main color, but the base is in the contrast color. And let me just get my 34 stitches that I need. Here we go. I've got my 34 stitches, and I continue. I join with the front of the sweater and continue working the chart. But it should be the chart row that was next in the chart before separating the sleeves. So I don't remember, I think for me it's chart row 11 of glue 3. But so yes, we have now placed these stitches on hold. They will be picked up along here when we do the sleeve. And when we get to the next locking marker, which is somewhere here, we'll be putting the second sleeve on hold in exactly the same way. I'll do that on my own time, and I'll come back to you once I've gotten to this point in the next round, because we're going to have to move this marker and place it and work following the chart, because the color work will continue, and place it in the middle of the underarm, and that's where the side will be. That's where we'll have a break in the pattern, because there is not enough space to fit complete chart repeats. So there will be a little fake seam using purl stitches, and that will provide that break in the pattern. I've got both sleeves separated, and I have gotten to on the next round to the point where I placed the marker just before casting on the underarm stitches. And here the pattern says to remove the marker and work following the chart across some number of stitches. So it's rather a large number to be able to follow the chart and count at the same time. So if you want, you can place a temporary locking marker there to stop you from going beyond. So for me that number is 17, exactly half of the underarm cast on stitches. So let me just count that out. Should be here. And if I could only close it, let me just verify that I didn't miscount anything. 1, 2, yes, 17 from both sides. And I'm continuing following the chart, working the colors as indicated in the chart. If I reach the pattern repeat, end of the pattern repeat, I have an extra little repeat marker at hand to place it there. And I am to place a marker for side here. And with main color, always with main color on every row, this next stitch will be purled, and it will create a nice side seam. Now I have used the first stitches of the front, so 17 stitches belong to the back and 17 stitches belong to the front. On the other side you'll see the same. You'll follow 16 stitches and then place the marker, because that last front stitch will be this purl stitch. But because the purl happens right after the marker, we just place the marker just before that stitch. And then it says to start following the chart from a specific stitch number, to make sure, because a full repeat doesn't fit here, you need to make sure that here again you start with the correct stitch so that this row aligns with all the previous rows. For me, that starting stitch is 3. I don't have the chart at hand as it is on the phone that I'm using to film, but I can cheat and look at my previous repeat. So I'm starting with 2 main color, 1 contrast color. Okay, so let's do that. 2 main color, 1 contrast color. At this place, you've got to be careful that you don't have too many stitches in the same color, and that you might need to trap the flow as well. And I will now have 6 stitches in main color. We'll trap float. And I now should have 4 stitches remaining before I restart the existing yoke stitches, and they should all be in contrast color, where this will depend entirely on the size you're working on and which row you're separating the sleeves, but whichever it is, you should not have any offsets. The pattern should continue seamlessly across these stitches and here. So that creates this little break in the pattern where you have to be careful that after every purl stitch you always start with that specified place in the chart, and it won't be a full repeat, so nothing to worry about. And one more thing that is also introduced in Clue 3 is an option to add shaping to the waist. So there's an option to continue the body straight or to add some decreases along the side seams here to decrease the circumference. And you can start that at the underbust or wherever you feel like it's appropriate to begin the decreases for your body type. And from that point you should measure how long is the distance between this point that you've picked to start the decreases to your waist, and pick the range. There's 3 ranges offered in the pattern in which that that distance falls, and that will tell you how many stitches and how many times and how in which rounds to do the decreases. But whichever it is, the decreases will always be the same. So first of all, we need to get to 2 stitches before the side marker. So I need to knit 1 more. And then we need to make a decrease that is left leaning. So an SSK, we want it to lean towards the side seam here. And we need to work it in the color that the next stitch is supposed to be, because we will sort of eat up that last stitch before the side seam. So for me that happens to be the contrast color, which means I will do the SSK in contrast color. Then we slip the marker, continue to purl with main color, but from this point on we have to re-establish a new starting stitch because we now have less stitches on the next section. So the starting stitch, the pattern repeat starting stitch, will also increase by 1. So whichever it was, we now need to add 1, and that will also be the color that we need to use to work the right leaning decrease. That's the opposite on the other side of the side marker. For me, again, that happens to be the contrast color, so I'm working the knit 2 together in that color. And then I continue following the chart all the way to 2 stitches before the other side marker and do exactly the same. Well, the other side looks slightly differently, probably because, as I mentioned before, the side seams use the stitches from the front section, so there will be a little bit of an offset on the other side. It's not as symmetrical, or for your size it might not even be as symmetrical as it is for me, because depending on how many stitches you put on hold for the sleeve, the pattern repeats might meet in a completely unexpected formation. And chances are that you will not be able to finish all of the decreases within the chart that is available in this glue. So if you do follow the waist shaping option, then you'll have to remember to carry on the decreases in the same cadence when the next glue comes out and you have the next chart at hand to follow. Now in Clue 5 we see that some of the floats towards the end of the chart are going to be very long, and if we stick to the original method of trapping floats, we risk that some of them might be showing through, and that's not entirely ideal. So here I'm offering an alternative option for catching long floats called the Ladderback Jacquard. It comes from machine knitting, and it's based on the concept of double knitting, and we just add extra stitches that are only visible on the wrong side, purely for the purpose of catching a float. And in the pattern you'll see 2 options for the charts for each type of chart. One will have these yellow columns that are suggested Ladderback Jacquard stitch placements, where we need to create those extra stitches. And the other one is the usual, in case you want to stick to what you already know and do away without the Ladderback Jacquard. So I am now in a place where in the Ladderback Jacquard stitch placement suggestion I have a yellow column, and the first I need to create that extra stitch, and I will be using the twisted lifted increase to do so. So I would have to work 7 stitches in the main color here at this point, but instead of and that would require me trapping a float somewhere. So I will be using Ladderback Jacquard. That requires for me to bring the working yarn, that is in my case a main color, to the front of work, and with the floating yarn, in this case it's the contrast color, create a new stitch with whichever knit increase or purl increase method you prefer. In this case I like my twisted lifted increase, and there we go. We then pick up the main color, again the working yarn, and continue working according to the chart, and we have caught this float with the help of an extra stitch that, trust me, will not be visible to the front. I'll have a few more opportunities to show you this here on this row. And I've come to another spot in the chart where I have a suggested Ladderback Jacquard placement. So again, I'll bring my working yarn to the front. That is a very important step because that is what conceals and hides this extra stitch from showing up at the front. And then I have to tug a little bit on this yarn when I restart working. Make sure that I bring this previous stitch and the new stitch as close together as possible to help with hiding that stitch that is there on the inside. Right, and I should have another one here. And we also need to ensure that we keep these floats here extra loose, because we don't want anything to pull on the fabric here, anything to disturb it. Otherwise we'll see little dents, and see what I mean by needing to tug it to bring them as close as possible. We don't want anything to pull on the fabric there. And I do that for all the repeats that I have here, and when I return to work the next round, I'll show you how you use the stitches to catch the long floats that will be appearing here. I worked a full round creating some of the first Ladderback Jacquard stitches, and here I'll show you how to catch them when you encounter them on the following rounds. So I am 1 stitch away from where I see this peeking Ladderback Jacquard stitch, and just like in the creation process, we need to make sure we bring the working yarn, the one that isn't floating, the one that's visible in the chart, to the front of work, and then we purl. You can also knit it or knit through the back loop or whatever. I prefer purling because then it'll look like a nice knit ladder on the wrong side. And pick up the working yarn and continue following the chart as if nothing happened, still keeping the floating yarn loose, because if we do not, then you can start seeing some puckering there. So we need to ensure that the floats here are very quite loose. I need to create one using the same steps we discussed in the previous round, and then in a minute I'll be able to show you once more. I've got about 9 stitches in main color to do, but after the first 2 I have a Ladderback Jacquard stitch, so I make sure I bring the main color to front, purl the Ladderback Jacquard stitch, pick up the main color, tug a little bit, knit another 5, encounter another Ladderback Jacquard stitch. Well, basically we bring, if you are purling the Ladderback Jacquard stitches, you are essentially bringing both yarns to front, leaving the main color to hang, purling the Ladderback Jacquard stitch, picking up the main color, all the time checking that the floats are loose, because we do not want any puckering. And voila, that is the Ladderback Jacquard, and we do that for the remaining chart rounds. After that we'll have to do another separate step to remove all these extra stitches, as they will not serve a purpose after we're done with the color work. I've completed all the rows in the colorwork chart, and I'm ready to start the plain stockinette section. I've already cut the contrast color, and normally what you would do with a Ladderback Jacquard stitch when it's no longer needed is when you get to it, you'd simply knit 2 together with the next stitch, and that works fine. However, you can see here that because there is a slight difference between the thickness of the main color and the thickness of the contrast color, namely that the main color is fingering weight, and also the contrast color is super high contrasting with the main color. I am seeing the legs of these stitches show through, and I'm not quite happy with that, so I'm going to do a little hack to try and minimize this appearance, and that will require me joining another strand off the main color and pretend that it's the contrast color. So I'll just grab a center pull from my existing yarn cake. I normally don't center pull because I don't like the leftovers. It's very hard to manage, but here for this short round that we need to do here is fine. I'll just tie a little knot to the contrast color, and that doesn't really matter. It will be easier to conceptually understand that this is still my contrast color. It just happens to be the same color as the main color. And then when we go over and make the decreases on the next round, at least we'll be knitting together 2 stitches that are in the same color. So I have attached another strand of main color to my contrast color here, and I will do another round of catching the floats using the Ladderback Jacquard. So that means bringing the main color to the front, using this reattached fake contrast color to purl the Ladderback Jacquard stitch, and then continuing working to the next Ladderback Jacquard stitch. Again, bring main color to the front, use the fake contrast color to purl the Ladderback Jacquard stitch, etc. all the way around. And now you can see that all of the stitches on our needles are in one color, and we shouldn't be seeing, well, when I get there I'll come back and we'll do it together. So I've done my round of catching the floats with this fake contrast color, and you can see here on the other side that I've got the one extra round there in yellows only. So I won't need this extra fake strand anymore. I can just go ahead and cut it. I'm going to try and stuff it in back in the cake so it doesn't get pulled and destroy my cake too much. Something like that. Okay, and now I am ready to remove the Ladderback Jacquard stitches. Now it's going to be a lot harder to identify which ones they are, but hopefully if you purl them they should stick out a little bit more, and if in doubt just turn the work to wrong side and you'll see which one it is that you need to get rid of. Generally they'll be about 5 stitches apart here, maybe with one exception somewhere in the middle of the pattern repeat, but it goes as in the previous round I demoed already. Just knit 2 together, and again knit 2 together, and you can see that there's absolutely no sign of the contrast color peeking through if you use this approach. And the Ladderback Jacquard stitches are disappearing. And yes, once you've done, I could have, if you used these chart repeat marker separator markers, then you can now remove them, because the color work in this clue and in this body is well and truly finished. And in clue 6 we are picking up stitches around the neckline to add a neckband. This is done so that you could adjust it in case there's something you're not quite happy with how it sits. You could do decreases to reduce the circumference if you needed to, or you can easily adjust the height of the neckband to your preferences. You could leave it as is by just picking up some stitches and doing an I-cord bind off. Anything goes pretty much. And so the first step is to pick up the stitches. If you used a long tail cast on like I have, and then you can follow along with me, but if you used a provisional cast on or any other cast on, then you're probably good to pick up stitches on your own there. First I need to find out where is the beginning of round, and I can just pull on this tail here to identify the first stitch, and I like to insert my needle through the stitches so that they align perfectly. Even though we're knitting in the opposite direction, it's going to be easier for me to stay consistent like that, and they won't be offset to the side. So I like to insert the needle through the actual stitch. It also leaves me with a thicker seam or a thicker edge there, and that adds extra sturdiness and prevents the neck from stretching out. As I'm using slightly marbled yarn, it's a little bit tricky to find where the stitches are, but that wasn't actually a stitch. So yes, I'll start here. I think that the first few are a bit tricky, but once you get going, it's fairly smooth. And you should have as many stitches. Oh, I forgot to mention that we're doing this with the smaller needle, the same that we used when we started the neck. This is what it should look like. I will say that I try to match, because I'm using color changing yarn, I try to match the color as closely to the beginning of the sweater as possible, because I didn't want there to be a noticeable color change. But if you're using a solid color, then you won't have this problem. But basically you should be using the contrast color and try and match the color so that it's a seamless transition into the neckband. And you pick up stitches all around and place a beginning of round marker, and once I've gotten there, I'll show you how we set up the intended ribbing. I've picked up stitches all around the neckline. I'm going to place a beginning of round marker and start the ribbing pattern for this. It's a 2x2 twisted rib, so it means that you should have a multiple of 4 stitches on your needles here. But if you don't, if you come to the last 4 stitches and you instead have 3 or 5, then just adjust them as you go. For example, make an increase or decrease 2 of the stitches, just so you get a multiple of 4. And so we will be knitting 2 through the back loop, purling 2 all around to the beginning of round marker, and we'll repeat this until we reach 5 centimeters or 2 inches, or whichever is your desired neckband height that you'd like. And then we just bind off, whichever bind off method you prefer. I'll be using the classical bind off. We'll begin the sleeve by first transferring the held stitches onto a set of the larger needle. And then we'll have to start color work right away, and we'll be following the chart that we followed in clue 3 at the time of separating the sleeves. So what we need to figure out is which row of that chart we need to do. It should be the one right after separation. So you can either look up in the pattern which row you separated at, or if you added extra rounds to increase the yoke depth, then you will know how many you added, and you can determine the row from that. I'm working on size 2 and I did not add any rounds extra, so I am starting with row 11. And the pattern specifies that depending on which sleeve you're working on, for me it's the left sleeve, which stitch you should be starting with. So it's useful to have that chart printed so you could draw the starting line for your size so you never get lost. But before you draw the actual starting line, mind you that the first couple of rounds will start the sleeve here, but once we have picked up the stitches along the underarm, the beginning of round will be shifted to the center of the underarm. So the actual beginning of round will be starting from here, and that will be an entirely different starting stitch. Just something to keep in mind. So the first couple of rounds we can do without drawing any lines. For me, that starting stitch is number 19. It happens to be worked in the main color, so I'm attaching main color. I will be getting rid of this slip stitch in the next round. And then I've got to do 3 stitches in the contrast color. That is all following the chart that we shared in clue 3. I do have a noticeable color difference here, but it's such a busy sweater that I think it won't have impact the overall look too much. So I will follow chart all the way to the other end of the live stitches, and then I'll show you what we do to pick up stitches here and how to continue from there. So I've arrived at the other end of the live stitches, and now I need to pick up stitches along the underarm cast on. And we also want to pick up an extra stitch here in the corner, because if we start picking up along the underarm cast on, you can see that there will be a giant hole. Sometimes I even pick up a few stitches, 2 or 3, depending on how stretched the hole is here at the time of me picking up, and then immediately decrease them in the next round. But my pattern there does include 1 extra stitch that's included in the stitch count by default. So I would like to find a strand in the corner here that I can pick up through, and that will minimize the hole there. If you noticed, I picked it up and knit it through the strand twisted. That tightens it up even more. And then it also says to pick up and knit half of the cast on stitches, probably to where we have that purl seam. That's where I'll be placing the beginning of round marker, and continue picking up all the way to the other end. And another thing to note is that while we are picking up these stitches using the main color, it's to simplify. If you are super advanced and you can see, oh, I've already made a mistake. This was supposed to be in main color. So let me just fix that quickly, because that will be showing up. It's quite forward. Where's my main color? And I'm instructed to pick up all stitches in main color, but if you are super advanced, you can continue following the chart across those underarm stitches and use the color that's indicated in the chart. For example, I'm right in the middle of a pattern repeat. I'd have to work 3 stitches in the contrast color. I could be picking up the stitches using contrast color, but to keep things simple for now, I won't. And you don't have to if you don't want to complicate your life. It's not like you walk around with your arms up high, so nobody will really see that there's a little line in main color. So yeah, I'll find the first cast on stitch, use main color to pick it up, and then the next one. Similarly, how I did for the neckband, I like to insert needle through the stitch, and then I can ensure the stitch counts match exactly those that were cast on, and there are no offsets of any kind. And now I have done 5 stitches in the main color. It's a good time for me to trap the contrast yarn because we will need it in the next round on the 5 stitches here to work the next row of the chart. It's important not to forget to carry that along. So I'll do a few more and trap it once more. And I will continue in this manner until I've reached that stitch count that's specified in the pattern. Place the beginning of round marker and continue picking up all the way to this other corner and pick up another stitch here in the corner, similar to how we did in the first one. And then we'll do another round, so to speak, all the way to 1 stitch before beginning of round marker, and I'll show you and explain to you why we're doing that. So I worked a couple of rounds of the sleeve, and I got a chance to set up the chart along the underarm cast on stitches here, which was simply following whatever was in the chart from the existing sleeve stitches. And we're always meant to stop 1 stitch before the beginning of round, because that one, as well as the next 2 in the new round, will always be worked in the main color. So I'll knit 1 in main color, start the next round, purl 1. That purl stitch should align with the purl column on the body, and knit another one in main color. And that way, when we do decreases, we'll always have 3 stitches, this line of 3 stitches just along, running through the whole of the sleeve, eating up the chart stitches and decreasing the circumference of the sleeve to get to the wrist one. And so whatever you do, you always work these 3 stitches in the main color. And this is also the first time you get to set the new starting stitch for the sleeve. So I'm starting with stitch number 3, and that is in main color. Well, I think I've got too many now in a row without trapping, so let me just quickly trap the yarn here. 1 in main color, 3 in contrast, and I should, if all goes well, I should just join these existing stitches and the pattern should align perfectly there. Mind you that just like with the body, the stitch pattern repeats here and the sides are not complete, and also the starting stitch for this round will only be that starting stitch before the decreases. As soon as we start decreases, if you haven't completed the chart C, you will need to move the starting stitch by 1, but I'll touch upon that when we get to the decreases. And right, I continue following the chart along the rest of the underarm stitches. And yes, it all worked out perfectly. I am joining, following the chart, and it aligns perfectly with the existing stitches. So for the time being, I will be starting working these 3 stitches surrounding the beginning of round marker in the main color, and following the chart, starting with stitch number 3 for my size for the left sleeve. It will be different for the right sleeve, and it will be different for different sizes until we get to the first decrease, which I'll come back and show. Here I have completed all the rounds before the first decrease round, and we will always do a decrease round the same way. So we'll purl the first one using main color, as we have done, and then to create that effect that these 3 stitches just form a uniform line along the sleeve, we have to make sure that this very first decrease leans in the left direction. And for that we'll use the SSK, that is slipping one knitwise, slipping one knitwise, and then knitting both of those through the back loop. You can see that the stitch is eating up that adjacent stitch. And this is where, because we lost the stitch column, we need to move the starting stitch of the pattern repeat to one stitch higher. So I started with the third stitch, and now after this decrease, well, during the decrease round, I'm starting with the fourth stitch. And I'll follow the chart all the way, this time to 2 stitches before the beginning of round, and I'll do a symmetrical right leaning decrease by knitting these two together. And then the pattern says to do a decrease round every X number of rounds, so we'll knit for me it's every 9th round, so that means I'll be knitting, working 8 rounds without decreases, and on the 9th round I'll do a decrease. And it also specifies the number of times that you should be doing the decrease. At some point you'll run out of the chart, and if you wish you can continue following the charts from clues 4 and 5, but I will stop there after finishing chart C in clue 3 and continue the rest of the sleeve with just main color, and we'll also continue purling the first stitch and continue with the decreases, obviously. If the sleeve length in the pattern is too long for you, feel free to stop the sleeve at any point you desire, around 5 centimeters or 2 inches short of your desired length, and you can start the cuff then. Just ensure that you have a multiple of 4 stitches at that point, because the cuff is the same ribbing as we used for the neckband and the hem.